Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
User living_dog89 asks about the first written record of the Persians, saying most narratives of the Persians typically start with the Assyrian struggles against the Medes, then the collapse of the Assyrian Empire to Babylon and Media, then starts with Thaspes or Cyrus afterward. Since the Persians ended up conquering Anshan and turned Elam into Persia proper, I'd like to know the first time the Persians are mentioned. Were they mentioned in Elamite text before Cyrus? What about the Assyrians or Babylonians? Did they have any conflicts or mentions specifically with the Persians prior to the Median Empire? I just go by my name, Trevor_Culley, and I answered, well, I'd say that not at least mentioning some of what I'm going to discuss here would be a bit of an academic oversight, but forgivable given the nature of the references to Persia, or at least something like it. One thing to note, because it's important to some of the translations, is that Cyrus is the Latin form of Greek kouros, which in turn came from the original Persian kurush. Likewise, that same name was rendered into Elamite and Akkadian in different ways. Strictly speaking, the first reference to Persia that we can firmly tie to, quote, Persia and the Persians, as we usually understand them, is actually a reference to Cyrus in the Babylonian Chronicle of Nabonidus, which was probably written/completed after Cyrus conquered Babylon, so sometime between 547 to 530 BCE. Quote, in the month Nisanu, Cyrus, king of Parsu, mustered his army and crossed the Tigris below Arbail, which is Arbela. See Assyrian and Babylonian Chronicles, chapter 7, document 2, lines 15 through 16. Outside of this reference, Babylonian documents, including the famous Cyrus cylinder, only refer to Cyrus as the king of Anshan. And Anshan did not appear in any Babylonian documents I know about for generations before Cyrus's reign. The same is actually true for the single document that both references a locale and can be identified with Cyrus's ancestors. A clay seal written in Elamite that simply reads, Cyrus the Anshanite, son of Thaspes. This was actually found at Persepolis, but as it references Cyrus the Great's grandfather, it is assumed to have originated in Anshan and been moved. There is another Elamite tablet that references Karashu in Susa. This could refer to Cyrus I or II, or really anyone by that name prior to Darius the Great building his palace on top of the cache of documents where this tablet was found. It is not a standard form of Cyrus in Elamite, so it's hard to know. Assuming these do refer to Cyrus I, they would be from the late 7th/early 6th century BCE. That's the extent for references to anything we might identify as Persian or Persia in Elamite records. That may be surprising, given the apparent conquest of one of Elam's principal cities sometime in the 7th century BCE. But Elam in the Iron Age was not what it once was. The kings in Susa continued to call themselves the King of Susa and Anshan, but Anshan itself had fallen into decline, and the surrounding region saw an almost complete abandonment of urbanization. In 691 BCE, just after the death of the last king to include Anshan in his title, the Assyrian king Sennacherib invaded Elam and named the Anshanites as his allies. In 653, another Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal, ravaged Elam once again, sending Susa into decline as well. Between the collapse of Anshan in the years before 691 and two brutal Assyrian invasions, Elam, i.e. Susa, went into rapid decline, and Elamite documents declined along with it, right around the same time that the Persians were first seizing power in Anshan. However, I should note, based on your post, that western Elam, around Susa, was not conquered and incorporated into Persia until the formation of the Persian Empire, when it remained a distinct province. Any earlier than that, and you enter into highly debated territory. There are a number of references to place names that are clearly related to Old Persian Parsa, meaning Persia. However, the further back you go, the more clear it is that these names do not refer to the region of Anshan in the modern Fars province. Instead, they refer to somewhere in northwestern Iran, which was later included as part of Media under Achaemenid rule. It is worth noting that one possible etymology of Parsa traces back to an Old Persian word that would mean frontier or borderland, similar to march or mark in European history. And it may have begun as a more generic descriptor before becoming associated with a specific cultural group. The most viable option that could refer to the Persians as we know them is from a cylinder inscribed with the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal's annals for around 639 BCE. When Kurash, king of Parsumash, heard of the mighty victory which I had inflicted on Elam with the help of Ashur, Bel, Nabu, and the great gods, my lords, and that I had overwhelmed the whole of Elam like a flood, he sent Aruku, his eldest son, together with his tribute, as a hostage to Nineveh, my lordly city, and implored my lordship. This would probably be a reference to Cyrus I as king of Persia, if we interpret both Kurash as the son of Tespes and Parsumash as the region around Anshan. At first glance, it really does seem to mention Kurash responding to Ashurbanipal's brutal attack on Elam, which would be near Persia if not including it, and may explain sending his son as a hostage. However, there are also discrepancies. First of all, it is odd that Cyrus I would portray himself to the Assyrians as king of Parsumash, rather than king of Anshan. We know from Babylonian accounts of Cyrus the Great that the Mesopotamians later referred to them as such, and that the Persians exploited Anshan's prestige in the Cyrus cylinder. We could suggest that Cyrus I had not yet conquered Anshan, but the Cyrus cylinder portrays Tespes as king there as well, so that seems less likely. Second, the timeline works, but just barely. Cyrus I's seal I mentioned is typical of the very end of the 7th century and early 6th century. for the genealogy provided by later Persian kings to work with Kurash of Parsumash, every single king of the dynasty would have to be very long-lived to squeeze 109 years into just 3 kings. We also know that period wasn't evenly divided because Cyrus the Great does not seem to have come to power until around 560 BCE, and thus only ruled for 30 years before his death in 530. Dinon of Colophon asserted that he was about 60 years old when he died, meaning that he would have been born around 590, closer to 585 if we follow Herodotus's timeline. Even if we assume Kurash and Aruku were both quite young, Kurash would have to live to nearly 70, and sire Cambyses I relatively late in life. Neither is impossible, but Kurash/Cyrus was not a unique name, and ultimately there's no reason that Kurash of Parsumash has to be Cyrus, son of Thespes. This is especially true in light of similar place names to Parsumash used by the earlier Assyrians. Prior to Ashurbanipal's reign, the territory of Parsua, or Parsuwash, was mentioned by several Assyrian kings as a province of the Assyrian Empire on the border with the Median city-states and other groups in the Zagros Mountains. The Assyrians rarely, if ever, penetrated as far as Anshan when they went into Elamite territory, and never ruled Elam outright to install their own governors. Parsua was clearly a territory in the region later known as Media, and may have been a Median kingdom based on these Assyrian descriptions. Parsua did fall out of Assyrian control in the early 7th century, which could explain the possible different context in Ashurbanipal's time. Its role as a buffer between Assyria and the Medes is emphasized in the Annals of Sargon II for 714 BCE. Quote, "To Parsuwash I descended, the city rulers of Namri, Sangibuti, Beit Abadani, and the land of the mighty Medes heard the coming of my expedition. The desolating of their lands in my previous year had remained in their minds, and terror fell upon them. Their heavy tribute they brought me from the midst of their country, and made Parsuwash my possession. From Parsuwash I departed." Its position as a province with a governor is described in the first reference to Parsua in our records, and thus anything resembling Persia. This is from Tiglath-Pileser III's Annals, circa 744 BCE. Quote, "I placed my official as governor over the land of Parsua, and my official as governor over the land of Bit Hamban. These lands I annexed to Assyria." So that is the very roundabout and overly complicated explanation. The first reference to Persia was sometime between 744 and 530 BCE. Parsua in 744 was definitely not Persia, as in Achaemenid Parsa, but is probably a related word, and could be the place where the Persians lived before moving south. Parsumash in 639 could be Parsa, but the evidence is shaky and complex. There is at least one reference to a person we know was Persian circa 600 BCE, but it calls him Cyrus the Anshanite. So the first definitive use of Parsu to reference Parsa did not come until the time of Cyrus the Great himself. Even then, it remained uncommon in the written record until Darius the Great and his successors. All translations are from the Persian Empire, a corpus of sources of the Achaemenid period by Amelie Kurt, edited only for easier readability. User Lord Cyber 36 asks, how did Cyrus the Great actually die? In his sleep or in battle? Who is right here, Herodotus or Xenophon? I just go by Trevor_Culley, and I answered, in this case, we are lucky that Herodotus and Xenophon are not our only sources. And spoiler, Xenophon is definitely the outlier, which is unsurprising, since Cyropedia is not a reliable source of Persian history, nor is it really intended to be. Instead, it is a political treatise and a historical romance, something I've written about before. Most modern historians do not dwell on the issue, but they tend to side with Herodotus, broadly speaking. There are 4 basic versions of the story told in 5 ancient sources. 1. Herodotus's Histories, Book 1, sections 205 to 214, and Justin's Epitome of Pompeius Trogus, Book 1, sections 8 and 9, say Cyrus was killed in battle with the Masagatai, just called Scythians by Justin and Trogus, on his northern frontier in the Central Asian steppe. The warrior queen Tomiris captured and decapitated his body and immersed it in a wineskin filled with blood. 2. Berosus's Babyloniaca, Book 3, Section 5, says Cyrus was killed in battle with the Dahai on his northern frontier, on the eastern shore of the Caspian Sea. 3. Ctesias's Persica, specifically fragment 43 from Stephanus of Byzantium, says Cyrus was wounded by a javelin from an Indian elephant rider while fighting the Derbakis on his northern frontier in Gandhara, and was taken back to camp to deliver his last will and testament to his sons before succumbing. And 4. Xenophon's Cyropedia, Book 8, Chapter 7. Cyrus died peacefully in his sleep at Babylon after giving his last will and parting advice to his sons. There are 4 more relevant sources that do not deal directly with Cyrus the Great's death, but instead discuss his tomb. One is naturally the tomb itself, the physical mausoleum still standing at Pasargadae. The other 3 are Strabo's Geographica, Arrian's Anabasis Alexandri, and Plutarch's Life of Alexander, all of which discuss Alexander the Great's visit to the tomb. All are important because they help refute one of Herodotus's claims, and the claims of Trogus/Justin who repeated them. Very clearly, the Masagatai did not capture and keep Cyrus's body. All of the sources for Alexander's visit describe the experience, and none of them even hint at the idea that Cyrus had been decapitated or otherwise disfigured. In fact, several of them comment on just how well preserved the body had been in wax, suggesting that Cyrus's corpse was transported back to Persia before decay could really set in. However, the very existence of the mausoleum and the splendor described by the Alexandrian sources also refutes Xenophon, who wrote on Cyrus's final wishes as, Now as to my body, when I am dead, my sons, lay it away neither in gold, nor in silver, nor in anything else, but commit it to the earth as soon as may be. For what is more blessed than to be united with the earth, which brings forth and nourishes all things beautiful and all things good? I have always been a friend to man, and I think I should gladly now become part of that which does him so much good. Not only was this obviously not what happened, but it is actually at odds with what we know about Persian burial customs more generally. All of the noble tombs we can identify or even theorize about are built from stone and elevated above the ground. Most of them have evidence for an elevated or sunken place to set the body or bodies within the tomb structure. If we extrapolate a little further, Xenophon's Cyrus is horrifyingly at odds with traditional Zoroastrian burial customs, which see burial directly in the ground as polluting a sacred element. Of course, there is lots of debate over whether or not to count Cyrus or any of his immediate successors as real Zoroastrians, but it is worth noting that Herodotus describes the Magi as practicing an early form of Zoroastrian excarnation, and all of the Persian kings do seem to have taken steps to avoid direct contact with fire, earth, or water upon their deaths. Then there's the issue of Ctesias and Berosus. Neither is usually considered a very reliable source for the early parts of their histories, and the surviving parts of the Babyloniaca are barely long enough to be useful. However, both were working with traditions otherwise unknown to the Greco-Roman world. Berosus was a Babylonian priest in the 3rd century BCE with access to Babylonian records. Ctesias was a Greek physician in the court of Artaxerxes II, and contemporary to Xenophon, who pulled much of his information from oral tradition circulating in the Persian court. Unfortunately, he also privileged the juiciest and most dramatic version of those traditions over accurate accounts. Still, both of them were working much more directly with stories of Cyrus's death than Herodotus, and have less dubious motivations than Xenophon. It would be great if Cyrus's tomb had been preserved like the best Egyptian counterparts, but it was unfortunately pillaged not long after Alexander's visit, leaving us to speculate based on the sources above. Ultimately, given the minimal variation between the 3 stories of violent death and their relative proximity to primary sources, it seems Xenophon's account is not historical and is intended to fit in with his larger romanticized image of Cyrus. User AJ_24601 asks, Alexander the Great's invasion of India gets no mention in Indian sources. All our knowledge of it comes from Greek sources. Are records lost, or did Indian historians consider it unimportant? I go by just my name, Trevor_Culley, and I answered, Indian history before the advent of Chandragupta Maurya's conquests immediately after the time of Alexander is an odd time frame to try and study. Most of the Indian sources for ancient history come from religious chronicles composed or preserved in China and Sri Lanka centuries after the events they describe. The narrative documents that don't fit into that description tend to have a legendary or fictional genre. There are also non-narrative texts, like the Arthashastra or the Ashtadhyayi, that could shine light on the period they were written in, but don't actually describe events. The almost bizarre thing all of these different texts of different genres, creeds, and time periods have in common is that they only begin to reflect the historic record west of India after Alexander. Alexander's absence from the record could be easily explained. It was the farthest any Greek force had ever gone. There were several hard-fought battles and dramatic political shifts. It would be natural from Alexander's biographers and their successors to overemphasize what really seems more like a raid in force for just 2 years. The problem with that easy dismissal is that the Achaemenid Empire, which claimed to rule the Indus Valley for 200 years before Alexander, is also missing from those sources. There are at least a few terms and groups referenced in some Indic literature that can be interpreted as broadly Iranian, and there's some limited archaeological evidence to support extensive contact. Hardly surprising for cultures sharing a border. But the undoubted regional, hegemonic economic and military power for 2 centuries also goes unmentioned. Any study on Achaemenid India is quick to point out that Alexander found little to no trace on Achaemenid government along the Indus Valley, and often suggest direct control was more ephemeral than the Persians would have us believe. But to not even be mentioned certainly stands out. This is even more striking given that many of the most important figures in Buddhist histories of the period are said to have studied and lived in Taxila, a city very close to Achaemenid territory, if not the seat of a local satrapy. In the grand scheme of things, Alexander was largely unimportant to India. Possibly before the Macedonian conqueror was even dead, Chandragupta Maurya was conquering the Punjab and ousting his governors if they were ever all that loyal to Alexander in the first place. Alexander's successors, first the Seleucids and then the Indo-Bactrians and Indo-Greeks, appear in Indian records as the Yavana, derived from Ionian via Persian and or Aramaic. But that's as close as we get to Alexander. What's confusing about the appearance of the Greeks in Indian history after the Maurya is that it rules out a lack of thought or importance about events in the West. It's hard to imagine that the Persians were less important than the Greeks who took their place. For whatever reason, the rise of the Mauryan Empire marks a turning point in Indian historiography, from something where Taxila and Gandhara mark the westernmost point of discussion to a more recognizable political narrative that acknowledges foreign invasion and interaction. Why this happened is hard to know. It's certainly possible that the explanation is simply a case of lost sources. The poets Asvaghosha, in the 1st century CE, and Kalidasa, circa the 5th century CE, both reference the works of earlier poets and authors, and plenty of ancient Indian texts refer to writing that we have no evidence of today. Just like the rest of the ancient world, monumental quantities of writing from all genres have been lost over time. The problem with this explanation is that it doesn't do much to explain why everything after this time only aligns with the classical and Near Eastern history after Chandragupta's rise to power. The only real way to make that work well is to suggest that there was some kind of mass culling of sources relatively early on that left later writers without anything to work off of in reference to Western events before that period. The other possible explanation is to say that writing was just not widespread enough before Chandragupta, and really before Ashoka, to expect any kind of detailed historical record. There is certainly evidence to support this. After the loss of the Harappan script, around the 20th century BCE, there are no surviving examples of writing of any sort in India prior to the 3rd century, at which point the Brahmi script appeared, most likely derived from the Aramaic alphabet. The development and spread of writing under the Maurya could help explain why historical records get so much better at that point. However, this explanation fails to explain why oral tradition would successfully record the political intricacies of the Mahajanapada and Nanda periods in the East without mentioning any political influence from the West. It's also worth noting that the earliest appearances of Brahmi script in stone don't necessarily mean that the edicts of Ashoka were the first time it was used. India's climate is not well suited to preserving perishable materials like leather, wood, leaves, and parchment, or anything written on those materials in Brahmi, Aramaic, or anything else. These documents would not have survived for us to know about it unless they were copied and copied and copied again. It's likely that there were written records prior to Ashoka. Then again, the Greek ambassador Megasthenes did describe the Maurya before Ashoka's time as, quote, a people who have no written laws, who are ignorant even of writing, and regulate everything by memory. Even if there were written records, there's no reason to think they would have been historic in nature. There's basically no evidence of historical writing east of Babylon prior to the 3rd century BCE, outside of China, which was not in contact with India at this point in time. So all of that leaves us with a great big disappointing question mark to explain why Alexander, his immediate successors, and centuries worth of his predecessors remain absent from Indian historical records, even after considering the possible explanations. User The Fish Lord asks, if I'm in ancient Persia at its height, what alcoholic beverage would I drink and snacks would I eat? I was wondering lately about what alcoholic drinks people in the past used to drink, and I saw that the week's topic was Persia, so I decided to ask. It's a hot day, I've been traveling along the royal road in Persia to different satraps, and I'm feeling a bit peckish. So I stop at an establishment and order an alcoholic beverage and a snack. What would I most likely get? And I just go by Trevor_Culley, and I answered, well, if you're on the Achaemenid Royal Road, you could be almost anywhere in West Asia. so your options are going to vary quite a lot from place to place, and probably depend on your social status a bit too. If you're looking for something to drink and take the edge off, your options are going to be wine or beer, basically all over the empire. But the local style and stock might vary a bit. Your beer probably won't be very strong or hoppy no matter where you go, so I hope you weren't looking for an IPA. If you're in Egypt or Mesopotamia, the locals are probably drinking beer just like they have for thousands of years. Fermenting wheat and barley in water had been standard practice in both regions for all of recorded history, and they exported the practice to all of their neighbors. In Egypt, where wheat was plentiful, more of the mash was made of wheat. In poorer and less fertile regions, barley was more popular. If you've wound up in Armenia, try not to get robbed by the mountain tribes and check out the local strong brew. Xenophon gave Armenian barley wine a 4-star review in his Anabasis, which is still a pretty good description of barley wine today. Quote, "There were stores within of wheat and barley and vegetables, and wine made from barley in great big bowls. The grains of barley malt lay floating in the beverage up to the lip of the vessel, and reeds lay in them, some longer, some shorter, without joints. When you were thirsty, you must take one of these into your mouth and suck." He's describing a straw here. "The beverage without admixture of water was very strong, and of delicious flavor to certain palates, but the taste must be acquired." Xenophon's description of barley wine is also a good point to transition to the other popular drink of the empire. You'll be able to find wine in all of the urban centers at this point, and you had been for at least 1,000 years. But it's much more popular under the Persians than it was 1,000 years earlier. The Caucasus and Zagros Mountains were some of the first places in the world to ferment grapes into wine. We don't know much about ancient Armenian wine culture, but wine was the favorite drink of the Persian aristocracy, and had been widespread on the Iranian plateau for millennia. The region of Parsa, the Persian homeland, was regarded as one of the best wine-producing regions of the world well into the Islamic period. Persian grape wine is probably also the most similar popular form of wine to the wine you are imagining. The Greeks and the cultures they influenced in Anatolia also loved wine, but the Greeks were kind of prudish about it. In Greek culture, the only proper way to drink wine, sometimes more like a wine concentrate, was to mix it with water. If you're in the Western Persian Empire and expecting an authentic Greek experience, expect wine to be poured into your cup from one vessel and then topped off with water from a special bowl on the side. If you're on the Mediterranean coast or drinking with Phoenicians in one of the ports all along the seaboard, you might find someone serving Phoenician or Cypriot raisin wine to satisfy a sweet tooth. On the other side of the empire, your options aren't as well known. If you're in India, there might be wine, but it's probably polluted with preservative agents to get it from the interior to the frontier. The local elites are only just catching on to the whole fermented grapes thing. Beer has been around there for a while, but we just don't know much about it, and you might have to pretend to be sick to get any from the locals. All of the sources from late Vedic India treat alcohol as a medicine more than a refreshment. If you have to swing northwest, you'll once again find wine in the cities, especially in Bactria. But once you get past the Oxus River, your options are limited. Wine was a commodity up here, and the most popular fermented drink is kumis, which is made from mare's milk and only has a slight alcohol content. As for snack time, we know a lot less about your options. It's not that we don't know what was around to eat, but we don't have much context for how it was prepared. If you're hurting for money, then your options were pretty simple: bread, cheese, and yogurt. Everyone eats bread. It's cheap, easy calories, and cheese and yogurt were an easy way to preserve your dairy products. What type of cheese depends on the common farm animals wherever you are. Cattle, sheep, and goats were all herded commonly in all parts of the empire. If you are just getting a snack before you continue on, then we can also safely rule out meat unless you are in the nobility. Slaughtering and preparing an animal is hard, labor-intensive, and costs you everything else that animal could have produced: fibers, labor, eggs, dairy, etc. Generally, you don't want to go through that unless you have a reason beyond just being peckish, and that holds true from the Nile to the Jaxartes. That leaves us with fruits, vegetables, and carbs. Unfortunately, we just don't know much about how this would be prepared. Polyaenus provides a list of ingredients that the kings would have access to, but no sense of how they were used. For the most part, a snack or small midday meal would probably consist of nuts, fruits, fresh or dried, and seeds, in addition to the bread and dairy products just about everyone had access to. Pistachios, sesame, pears, apples, and mulberries all appear regularly in the lists of rations provided to workers near Persepolis, so we can probably guess that those were common parts of the local diet in southern Iran.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.